And as we said, Juneteenth is the holiday that commemorates the official end of slavery in the United States, honoring freedom and resilience. We have in studio the man, the myth, the legend, as we like to call him at 25 News, Garry Moore, joining us. Hello, welcome back.
Welcome to me. Wow, yeah. This is amazing. I love it. I love what you've done with the place.
A lot has changed, but we are honored to have you here to talk about this holiday that deserves to be recognized.
It does.
And as someone who's actually traveled to the continent, because Africa is not a country, who's traveled to the motherland, what are some of the connections you see between Juneteenth and the broader story of African identity?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I think many of us who consider ourselves cultural preservationists or get into the culture know that we are the descendants of Mother Africa. You know, the mother has 4 daughters. One is taken to Cuba by the Spanish, another taken to Brazil by the Portuguese, another taken to Haiti by the French, and then the English take those of us. You know, that's the reason why we speak English. And so it's very important for us to know that we shouldn't start our history with slavery. It goes back. 2 specific answers to your question: music and food. You know, as a musician, just getting to know the music of Africa, and Sharon Reed, my big sister, will tell you that that whole call and response, the Negro spiritual, the vibrato in the voice, you know, the way we phrase things, you know, all of these are Africanisms in the music. And then the food, Peoria was blessed, a few days ago at the Peoria Public Library to welcome Michael Twitty, the author of the Cooking Gene. And he talks about those dishes that were made during slavery out of necessity, using the scraps of the pig, you know, and how Africans were genius in terms of culinary arts in Africa. You know, when black people were brought from Africa to the United States, the enslavers knew that they were bringing skilled artisans and skilled laborers and skilled farmers, etc., and those who were skilled in the culinary arts.
Yeah, and with all of those trades and skills that the people had and the understanding of African culture, why is it important for the African American community, as they celebrate Juneteenth, to have the understanding that our history did not start with slavery?
Because I think, unfortunately, slavery has done a psych job on a lot of black people. You know, black people, unfortunately, have bought into this idea of being inferior or not good enough, or that white people somehow or another did us a favor by getting us out of Africa and bringing us here, forgetting that, you know, we had great civilizations when a lot of European societies were in caves, you know, and that the Moors' contribution to Spain, you know, even going back to the beginning of humanity and the beginning of civilization in the Nile Valley. You know, it's important for us to know that, so that we don't just pick up, oh, Juneteenth, they freed us, and then we move on forward.
Yeah. And as you learn the history and the culture and the origination of the roots of our people, how do you kind of, in your own way, incorporate that in modern times, in your modern experiences in day-to-day life?
Wow. I try to decorate my house, my office, my whatever, with whatever of the culture that I can latch onto. You know, I did the African ancestry deal. I went through AfricanAncestry.com, traced my roots, you know, to Nigeria with my father and the Cameroon with my mom. You know, I don't want to forget. I try to go back, you know, as often as I can. I'm in touch with people, just so that I don't forget. I don't want to slip into the psych job of thinking that somehow or another I'm less than.
Yeah. Well, Garry Moore, it has been wonderful. Of course, we want Juneteenth to be a holiday that is celebrated for the freedom that comes with it and not a reflection of the tragedy before it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. We got more 25 News Midday coming up after the break.